What's up? Tonight's story is titled, What Would Occur in the Event You Awoke One Morning Within the Core a Long Time? If this style of storytelling helps you chill out and fall asleep peacefully, please think free to like the video and subscribe to my channel. Additionally, let me comprehend within the feedback where and at what time you are listening. Now, for those who are competent, flip off the lights and create a calm surroundings for yourself, accompanied through the smooth crackling of a fireside. Weave this immersive story. If, by means of some quiet twist of circumstance, you had been to awaken one morning in the core a long time, it will now not be to the sound of alarm clocks or the hum of cutting-edge machinery, but alternatively to a stillness broken handiest through the faraway call of a cockerel or the moving of wind through picket shutters, loosely latched in the course of the nighttime. There could be no glass on the windows, nor any insulation in opposition to the nippiness, and so the cool dampness of early air would have settled upon the internal of the small, dimly lit room where you determined yourself, a room of uneven stone or possibly packed earth, topped with a ceiling of tough picket beams, their edges darkened via the passage of years and the gathering of soot from the relevant fireside. The mattress, if it might be called that, would consist no longer of springs or reminiscence foam, but of a thick woolen sack filled with straw, hay, or dried heather, relying on vicinity, wealth, and season. This sack would doubtless be laid throughout a wood frame or, in additional modest properties, effectively arranged upon the floor, supported only via woven ropes, or even naked planks. The bedding could include a linen sheet, coarsely spun, and possibly a woolen blanket or two, dyed in faded earth tones or left uncolored, scratchy in opposition to the dermis, heavy however comforting in its familiarity. These objects made by means of hand would have taken months to supply and could be used for years, handed down or repurposed when frayed, worn, or mended beyond usefulness. Upon awakening, one would find no immediate source of man-made gentle. Candles have been high-priced, beeswax rarer than tallow, and each were used sparingly. As a result, the only illumination would come from the gradual diffusion of average sunlight hours, filtering in by way of small, on the whole, unglazed windows, covered maybe with oiled parchment or thinly stretched horn. These materials distorted the view, however, allowed some light to go, adequate for moving about, although now not for studying, even if books had been on hand, which they'd now not be. In most households, literacy would now not be long established. In fact, it might be just about utterly absent. Certainly in rural areas, the morning events would now not begin with haste, but as an alternative unfold. According to the rhythm of the solar, most folks would rise quickly after dawn, having long gone to sleep rapidly after nightfall, not out of option, however, out of necessity. In the absence of electric mild, and with firewood being a resource to be conserved, the hours of wakefulness have been intently tied to the average cycle of daytime. The average medieval character, whether or not a peasant within the nation-state or a craftsman in a city, would have structured their day around the availability of daylight. Waking before dawn would have been amazing, although no longer unheard of, principally in occasions of planting or harvest, that soon as wakeful the first venture do not have been breakfast, as a minimum no longer in the experience one might count on. Instead, the precedence can be to rekindle the hearth. Hearths were seldom allowed to go completely cold for the duration of the night-time, and if the embers still glowed underneath a overlaying of ash, they'd be gently stirred and coaxed again. Two lifestyles with kindling, twigs, dried grass, or shavings cautiously set aside the day earlier than, if the fireplace had long passed bloodless, then flint and steel would be employed to strike sparks, a mission requiring patience and expertise, primarily in damp conditions. The fireside, traditionally situated within the center of the room or built into the wall if the home had a chimney, a function more common in Northern Europe by means of the later core ages, would have served more than one purposes. It might have offered heat, mild, and a surface for cooking. Foods were not eaten cold except by way of necessity or in hotter seasons when fires had been less more often than not maintained. The rekindled hearth can be used to warmness, water, to prepare a thin gruel of oats or barley, or to reheat leftover pottage, a vegetable headquartered stew that mostly served as a near-consistent aspect of everyday food regimen, changing best moderately with the elements available. Food training would be basic. There would be no sugar for sweetening, no coffee or tea for stimulation, and little or no spice, external of salt or If one had been fortunate, a trace of dried herbs. Utensils would be minimal: a picket spoon, a knife, probably a single shared bowl. Bread, when available, would be coarse, darkish, and erratically baked, normally containing bits of chaff or flour husk, and leavened, no longer with commercial yeast, however, with a bit of dough saved from the earlier batch. In some regions, bread was once baked in communal ovens, with households bringing their formed loaves to be cooked alongside others, marked with symbols or initials to determine them once carried out. Once nourishment, however modest, had been taken, the following pursuits would have worried normal hygiene, although the thought of hygiene in the medieval interval bore little resemblance to latest practices. Washing the face and arms in bloodless water drawn from a bucket or well was original. Cleaning soap, when used, was once made out of animal fats and lye, and was once coarse, pungent, and used sparingly. Teeth were not brushed, though some individuals chewed twigs or rubbed their gums with salt. Hair, regularly long and unstyled for men, and continuously included for women, would be arranged without mirrors, using fingers or bone combs. Apparel do not need being changed daily. Correctly, for a lot of the same set of clothes can be worn for a few days, or even weeks, especially in wintry weather. Garb, too, was once easy. The fundamental clothes for men consisted of a tunic, hose or leggings, and perhaps a cloak fixed with an easy brooch. Ladies would wear a long robe, on the whole woolen, with an apron and head overlaying, reminiscent of a wimple or veil. Relying on neighborhood customized and marital repute, the colors have been muted, derived from traditional dyes, and any ornamentation would have been minimal until one belonged to the nobility. Shoes, frequently manufactured from leather, was once plain and lacked rough soles, making strolling over rough ground a slower and extra careful exercise. The village, if that is the place you had awoken, would have been quiet in these early hours, with handiest the occasional sound of movement, possibly a bucket being filled on the well, a door creaking open, or the distant lowing of cattle. Most houses would have had one or two animals: chickens, a pig, maybe a goat, all of which were saved close for useful causes, including warmth and theft prevention. Cattle performed an imperative position in the household economy. They usually had been fed and cared for earlier. Then every other work commenced. The layout of the village would have been acquainted and unchanging: a cluster of small wood or wattle and daub dwellings, arranged round a central root or green, possibly including a church. A small stone building, if the village was once old or wealthy, sufficient, and possibly a manor residence or hall belonging to the nearby lord or reeve. The manor would have been the center of administrative and financial lifestyles, and at the same time it might no longer were imposing in size. It held significance within the daily rhythms of the village. Its presence were permitted, expected, and generally unquestioned. As the solar rose bigger and the village stirred to fuller life, the day would continue into its more energetic phases, governed now not by way of man or woman alternative, but through seasonal cycles, agricultural demands, and feudal responsibility. Yet in these earliest hours, everything would have moved slowly. There were no urgency, no rush. Handiest, the cautious repetition of duties that had remained unchanged for generations. And so, within the stillness of your first medieval morning, the sector round you might have seemed each unfamiliar and strangely repetitive. The soundscape would have been quiet, the smells earthy and smoky, the textures coarse, the colors muted, and the routines dictated not by ambition or timetable, but by using weather, daylight hours, and long-centered custom. On this sluggish awakening, there would have been little to do, however, become aware of, and to begin, ever so gently, the lengthy day ahead. As soon as the first light of morning had given technique to the faded brightness of mid-morning, and as soon as the embers within the fireside had been stirred, and once the modest meal had been taken in silence or murmured dialogue, the work of the day would start, no longer unexpectedly, and not with ceremony, however, with a quiet and gradual transition, marked much less by using urgency than with the aid of the ordinary repetition of essential tasks. In a normal medieval village, the hobbies undertaken by means of nearly all of inhabitants would not have diversified extensively from one day to the following, nor from one season to the next. Besides, in degrees of intensity and period, the workday, shaped by way of usual light and the sluggish turning of the seasons, would have adopted patterns that had remained mostly unchanged across generations. In a small rural settlement, the place most people were sure with the aid of the tasks of the manorial system. The constitution of everyday labor was once divided between the land held in tenancy and the land held in service to the lord. The usual peasant, recognized variously as a villein, serf, or cotter relying on neighborhood customized and authorized standing, would have owed a section of his time, usually 1 day per week, commonly 3, to the domain, or lord's, land. This work was once not paid in coin, however rendered as a responsibility, a type of feudal employ that allowed the peasant to until his possessed strip of land on different days. The labor would have begun with sluggish, deliberate education. Instruments had been easy and few. A picket plough, mainly drawn by way of oxen, would have been used to turn the soil, and this procedure, certainly on heavier clay soils, was once gradual and worrying. The plough itself would have needed typical concentration, its iron ploughshare, if the village had one, being useful and sometimes shared communally. The harnessing of ox and wood were carried out without haste, the animals being led from their modest shelters and secured with thick leather-based straps or hempen ropes, commonly requiring more than one person to guide them into roll. On days no longer devoted to the lord's domain, peasants would have labored their own narrow strips in the open discipline method. These strips weren't contiguous, but scattered across the landscape, alloccated, in long skinny parcels to ensure equity of soil first rate. The system was once cooperative, but it surely was once also restrictive. Person selections had been restricted. Crop rotations were determined communally. One discipline would lie fallow each and every 12 months, while the others would endure wheat, barley, oats, or rye, according to local stipulations and collective contract. The fallow discipline may be used for grazing animals, and its fertility would slowly be restored through the typical approaches of weathering and animal manure. Tasks during the workday have been repetitive and bodily tiring, though they had been carried out with a constant, measured percent. Weeding, sowing, reaping, threshing, all had been completed by using hand, making use of sickles, flails, and baskets. There was once no mechanization. Reaping, for example, worried the gradual and careful chopping of grain with quick blade sickles, stooping for hours in the solar. Threshing, which might take position in barns or open yards, required beating the harvested grain with wooden flails to separate the husks. Winnowing concerned tossing the grain into the air so that the wind could lift away the chaff. Each and every method had its season, and each season was marked by way of its own detailed burdens and rituals. None of them hurried, none of them unfamiliar. For women, the workday would have adopted parallel but particular patterns. In addition to serving two in the fields throughout busy occasions equivalent to planting and harvest, females were liable for a large variety of home and agricultural tasks. These incorporated spinning wool or flax into thread, tending vegetable gardens, caring for kids and elderly family contributors, getting ready meals, baking bread, milking animals, feeding chicken, and processing dairy into butter or cheese. These duties had been carried out virtually the home, in most cases in the open yard, and had been accompanied by means of consistent movement, moving between the hearth, the backyard, the good, and the byre. The rhythm was regular and frequently quiet, interrupted simplest by means of imperative conversations, the cry of a youngster, or the low bleating of goats. Youngsters, too, had their roles, even as young ones would play or be carried about. Older children were built in early into the cycle of labor. Boys could scare birds from the plants, collect firewood, or are likely to pigs. Ladies might help with washing, spinning, or food education. There was no formal education in most villages. Learning used to be realistic and oral, handed down via demonstration and repetition. Songs, sayings, and rhymes have been used to educate planting times, animal care, and religious observance. It was once no longer unusual for a child of 10 or 12 to perform duties similar to those of an grown-up. As the solar climbed higher within the sky, the percent of labor would stay slow, but power. There would now not typically be an extended destroy for midday meals. Rather, meals may be eaten in the discipline: a crust of bread, a section of cheese, just a few onions, or dried beans, washed down with ale or skinny beer, which was once safer to drink than untreated water. The ale used to be susceptible in alcohol and brewed in general, not for pleasure however, as an essential part of the eating regimen. In many households, brewing was once achieved via women, with every batch recorded by memory and activities as an alternative than written recipe. If it had been market day, traditionally held once per week in a nearby city or bigger village, some individuals might journey by means of foot with items to exchange or sell. These might include surplus eggs, bundles of herbs, or small objects of craft, such as carved spoons or dyed wool. The ride could be sluggish and deliberate, begun at daybreak and back from before nightfall. Along the best way, the roads can be uneven, unpaved, and usually muddy, exceptionally after rain. Footside visitors would incorporate different villagers, clergy, beggars, and possibly the occasional journeying service provider or reliable. Encounters have been brief, formal, and regularly uneventful. Those who held specialized roles, such as the miller, the blacksmith, or the carpenter, would have had days structured in a different way. Yet even these trades had been ruled by using the equal gradual PC and reliance on guide labor. The mill, powered by using water or wind, floor grain into flour in sluggish, rhythmic turns, its creaking and groaning accepted as part of the village soundscape. The smithy, full of smoke and the smell of iron, would produce nails, horseshoes, and hinges, all made with care, now not pace. The chippy would restore carts, build doors, or form beams, working with few tools, each stroke measured and purposeful. Time was marked not through minutes or seconds, however, by way of usual routine. The position of the solar, the length of shadows, the sound of bells from a nearby monastery, or the calls of animals. The proposal of hourly productivity was once now not yet dominant. The day unfolded in keeping with the desires of the season and the needs of the land. Work ended no longer when a project was once completed. However, when the sunshine started to fade, in the colder months, this happened prior, and days had been correspondingly shorter. Within the long days of summertime, work would extend, except late in the night, as dusk approached. Tools had been cleaned and saved, animals had been fed all over again, and doorways were secured against the coming nighttime. The fields could be left to the wind and the birds, and the people would return to their properties. The place the evening meal could be all set. The fire would be banked again, and clothes hung to dry near the hearth. Silence would begin to settle, damaged most effective by the occasional bark of a canine, the low hum of conversation, or the faraway tolling of a bell marking vespers, reminding all of the rhythm of prayer that underpinned the rhythm of labor. There was little version from some day to the next. The identical tasks can be repeated, day after today, and tomorrow, and again in the course of the month. The calendar was punctuated via feast days and saints' days, in the course of which work could pause. But even on these days, the tasks of survival continued. There was constantly whatever to fix, whatever to comb, something to carry, something to stir. Yet there was, additionally, a form of alleviation within the repetition, a familiarity in the known. And so the workday handed, quietly, continuously, without drama or interruption, without surprises or alarms. The sun would set, and the village would dim, and preparations for the night would begin. There can be no file of the day's hobbies, no journal entry or report. Most effective the fading memory of another day fulfilled within the carrier of the land and of the Lord, and of the unchanging sample that defined existence in the center a while. Because the sun dipped slowly beneath the edge of the sky and the long shadows stretched throughout the fields, the medieval day entered its final section, no longer with haste or clamor, but with a sluggish and measured winding down. The rhythm of the evening used to be now not marked by vivid electric lamps or chiming clocks, however, by using the changing hue of the sky, the deepening coolness of the air, and the gradual retreat of human sounds from the village paths and fields. Night arrived now not as an occasion, however, as a gradual easing, a descent into stillness. Via this time, most work within the fields would have ceased. Tools, still heat from use, would have been gathered and introduced again to their storage. Areas, a nook of the cottage, a shared shed, or a lean-to beside the byre. Blades were wiped with cloths or straw to take away clinging earth, and picket handles checked for cracks or splinters. A worn device used to be not discarded, however mended. Iron was once luxurious, an alternative would take weeks or months. Sharpening, when required, was executed with stones worn soft via long use, more often than not handed down from mum or dad to baby. There was once no expectation of pace. There was once simplest the requirement of readiness for the next day to come. Animals, too, had been introduced again to their shelters. Chickens had been coaxed into coops or bushes, pigs pushed gently into pens, cows and goats led to stalls. With handfuls of hay or bundles of leaves, the buyer hooked up to or near the apartment, supplied both shelter for the animals and warmth for the family, as the physique heat of livestock would elevate the ambient temperature of adjacent rooms. By way of a number of priceless levels, the mingled smells of straw, earth, and manure were not disagreeable to the medieval nostril. They were acquainted, steady, and hardly ever remarked upon. The night might be bloodless, and the presence of dwelling creatures, even noisy ones, was once regarded extra alleviation than nuisance. Inside the house, preparations for the evening meal had already begun. The fireplace, cautiously tended via the day, was once now the significant center of attention. As soon as again, if wooden had been gathered in ample wide variety, the fire can be fed to produce a steady flame. If now not, embers would be stirred, and coaxed to life with dried kindling. The meal would no longer be complicated, nor diverse. It would possibly encompass pottage, a thick, gradual cooked stew of legumes, grains, and any vegetables that had been on hand. Into this perhaps brought scraps of meat, a bone for flavor, or dried herbs, if the garden had yielded any. The style was acquainted and responsible. Salt, used sparingly, offered upkeep more, most often than flavor. The bread, if there used to be bread, could be the day before today's or the day before's, as baking was now not completed every day, unless a household was once large or wealthier than most. It used to be coarse, dense, and chewy, on the whole darkened through bran or combined grains, slices possibly warmed on the fringe of the fireplace, or softened within the pottage. There have been no forks. Spoons have been shared or carved from wooden, and fingers have been used freely. Meals had been taken in silence or low dialogue, with pauses between every mouthful, no longer from etiquette, but from reflection or fatigue. The evening meal was once a time of slowing, no longer of gathering. For most, it was eaten speedily and adopted by means of relaxation. Lighting fixtures, if any, was dim. Tallow candles, produced from animal fat, were malodorous and smoky. They have been burned reluctantly and sparingly, used simplest when obviously vital. Rushlights reeds dipped in fats, burned more cheaply however, with less steadiness. Firelight from the hearth provided the foremost illumination, casting shadows on uneven walls, flickering gently throughout the faces of these seated locals. The light was no longer ample for studying or embroidery. However, it was once enough to look by using, and enough to create a sort of quiet intimacy in the small, enclosed house. Night occupations assorted little. If instruments required mending, this used to be finished via firelight. If wool had been spun for the period of the day, it could now be wound into balls, or laid apart in baskets. Nets possibly repaired, baskets rewoven, or leatherwork sewn. These duties, repetitive and gradual, were typically achieved with quiet buzzing or whispered prayers. Children, if reward, were already drifting toward sleep. Aged, loved ones, members, seated just about the fire, could present a phrase or two of guideline or remembrance, their voices low and measured, their sentences trailing off into silence. Prayer marked the passage into nighttime. In devout households, which intended, in apply, most households, evening prayers had been said aloud. These were not spontaneous but repeated, discovered through coronary heart, and stated in a lot, the equal approach each night, invoking the security of saints and the Virgin Mary, beseeching well-being, and asking for forgiveness. The Lord's Prayer, the Hail Mary, and a few regional litanies were the most usual. There was once little variation, and no need for it. Religion, like labor, used to be steady and familiar. When it got here time to sleep, the preparations relied on wealth, status, and area. In most peasant properties, all contributors of the household shared a single room, and more often than not, a single drowsing area. Privateness was once unknown. Children could sleep on the foot of the father and mother bed, or on straw mats, a cradle probably suspended from a beam, or placed almost the hearth for warmness. The sleeping floor, whether or not a wood body or a mattress of straw, would have been ready in silence, flattened by means of hand, protected with woolen blankets or historic cloaks, and adjusted for relief, most effective with situation. There was once no nightwear within the modern experience. Most people slept within the equal undergarments worn during the day. In winter, cloaks or outer tunics perhaps used as added layers. Toes have been quite often wrapped in material, and heads, oftentimes protected with linen caps to safeguard in opposition to the cold. The darkness that came with dusk was absolute. With shutters drawn and fire-banked, the one sound might be the creaking of beams, the far-off barking of a dog, or the muffled cry of an animal in the byre. These sounds, a ways from being disruptive, have been expected, even comforting. Sleep itself was once normally divided into two components. The inspiration of first sleep and 2D sleep has been found in various old records. The primary sleep would final from shortly after dusk until round middle of the night. During the quiet awake period that adopted, members would pray, talk softly, are likely to the hearth, or participate in small duties. Then, because the night time deepened, the 2D sleep would, lasting until the earliest mild of daybreak. This segmented pattern was no longer regarded as distinct, and was, actually, mirrored in folk knowledge, in liturgical apply, and even in legal customs. Desires have been not often recorded, but when they had been, they tended to hold religious meaning or reflect concerns about the harvest, illness, or divine want. Most folks, nevertheless, don't have spoken a lot of desires, for the reason that they're exclusive or superstitious. What mattered extra was once rest, not in the sense of luxurious or relaxation. However, as preparation for the repetition of the next day too comes labor. Rest was once useful, no longer indulgent. The physique used to be laid down in quiet submission to the cycle of nature, the need of God, and the demands of the earth. Night watch used to be rare in rural communities, although a couple of households would take turns guaranteeing the hearth did not exit absolutely. In higher settlements, or in towns with gates, a watchman could patrol with a lantern, his steps echoing softly on stone streets, his presence more symbolic than preventive. In smaller areas, security got here from familiarity and proximity. Neighbors knew each and every other. Theft was once infrequent, and disputes were probably settled communally, and so the village slipped into darkness. Slowly, gently, without alarm or interruption, the final embers of the fire were blanketed to keep warmness. The animals ceased their movements, the voices pale. The arena grew quiet once more. The stillness of nighttime used to be whole. Now not absolute silence, but a deep, sluggish quietness that invited sleep no longer as escape, however, as continuation. In this quiet rhythm of winding down, there have been no surprising ends, no sharp conclusions. Most effective the gradual yielding of day into night, of motion into rest, of motion into stillness. It was once no longer unlike the rhythms of the earth itself, slow, cyclical, unchanging. Sleep, within the center a while, got here now not from seeking it, however, from drifting into it, surrounded with the aid of the familiarity of repetition, the dim glow of coals, the scent of wool and smoke, and the skills that the next day can be, in almost every manner, very so much the same. In the lengthy centuries we now call the middle a while, faith used to be not a separate part of lifestyles, nor a non-compulsory set of beliefs held at the margins of inspiration. However, rather the organizing framework through which all expertise, all routine, and all figuring out of the world was once filtered, strengthened, and explained. From beginning to loss of life, from waking to slumbering, from planting to reap, and even in probably the most mundane of tasks, the presence of the church was once gently but continually felt. It was not loud, it was no longer normally noticeable. However, it was consistently there. In the village, the church, constructing whether of stone, of bushes, or waterland, daub occupied a important or relatively extended position, not for explanations of grandeur, but considering that the land had been put aside long in the past, mostly before memory could record it. Its bell, even if modest, served as the unofficial timekeeper of the village. It rang no longer in certain hours, however, in rhythm with the liturgical schedule, marking lauds at daybreak, terce, mid-morning, sext at noon, and vespers in the early evening. These bells were not constantly heard by using all, nor obeyed with precision. However, they fashioned a refined historical past hum towards which life was once measured. Most villagers were not literate, and most would not have owned books and even visible them. The Bible itself, written in Latin, remained in the custody of the priest. whose undertaking it was to interpret its stat means and relay its lessons. The carrier too was performed in Latin. Understanding the words was once less important than gazing the varieties, repeating the gestures, and feeling the alleviation of a well-recognized and steady ritual. The Mass, celebrated every day or weekly relying on resources, used to be no longer an occasion of spectacle, however, of slow and anticipated efficiency, held at an altar draped with linen, surrounded through candles, and accompanied by means of gradual, deliberate movements. Attendance at church used to be expected, though not at all times enforced. On feast days, it was once obligatory. On Sundays, strongly inspired. People who failed to attend without intent might be noticed, although punishment was once hardly ever harsh. Extra customarily, absences have been met with quiet correction, a talk over with from the priest, a mention during confession, or a murmured comment with the aid of a neighbor. The church didn't operate by means of fear in most locations, but by way of repetition, statement, and sluggish shaping over time. The intention used to be not unexpected conversion, but gradual alignment with the communal rhythm of devotion. Confession was conducted in privateness, but most often introduced in advance. Parishioners would come ahead, one by one, to speak softly of their sins that have been most likely now not dramatic in nature, however worried with gossip, neglected prayers, marital disputes, or minor dishonesty. The priest would present penance, on the whole in the form of repeated prayers or small acts of charity. The confessional procedure used to be not deeply introspective, nor psychologically intricate. It was once practical, repetitive, and grounded in the perception that sin was a situation to be managed, now not a difficulty to be solved. The liturgical calendar structured the complete 12 months, and each part of it used to be related to particular tasks, fasts, and celebrations. Lent, a period of 40 days leading as much as Easter, required abstinence from meat, dairy, and frivolity. Advent, preceding Christmas, was a quieter time of training. Feast days honored saints, some generally well known, others local and vague. The day of Saint Apollonia, for instance, possibly marked in a single village and not noted in one more. These observances weren't optional distractions from labor, but integrated into the work itself. A feast would contain relaxation from the fields. A fast could require ingredients to be altered. A saint's day would contain a procession, a specified mass, or a communal meal, all stylish on assets, climate, and custom. Holy days were most of the time the only breaks within the long, repetitive cycles of labor. On such days, humans gathered in the churchyard, exchanged news, listened to quick sermons, and engaged in video games or dances, all underneath the watchful eye of the clergy. These gatherings weren't intricate, but they were predicted. They marked time, offered variation, and bolstered a shared feel of belonging. They weren't always joyful in the brand new sense, but they had been famous as imperative pauses in the fabric of village life. Pilgrimages had been much less normal in smaller communities, however, were not unparalleled. An experience to a neighborhood shrine or relic possibly undertaken to fulfill a vow, seek therapy, or provide thanks. For many, these journeys had been brief, might be to a local abbey or chapel known for a targeted miracle. Lengthy pilgrimages, to Santiago, to Rome, or to the Holy Land, have been infrequent, costly, and undertaken only by the wealthy, the devout, or the determined. Reviews of such journeys filtered again slowly, advised through returning tourists, whose words were obtained with surprise, however, now not imitation. Monasteries, if placed neighborhood, served as quiet facilities of studying, self-discipline, and prayer. The monks lived by means of the rule of thumb of Saint Benedict, or identical codes, rising at midnight to chant psalms, eating in silence, copying texts, tending gardens, and performing works of charity. Most villagers do not entered the cloister, however they revered it. The monks, distant and quiet, had been seen as guardians of prayer on behalf of all. Their role was once passive, however, strong not to preach, however to hope, eternally and without pause. Clerical visits, equivalent to those through the bishop or archdeacon, came about hardly ever, and when they did, had been marked by means of cautious training. The roads were smoothed, the church cleaned, the files inspected, tithes had been discussed, the 10th component of produce or revenue owed to the church, now not continually paid in full, however anticipated. However, tithes perhaps, rendered in grain, eggs, wool, or labor, and their collection used to be recorded through the priest or his assistant. The process used to be tricky in concept, but in apply used to be adjusted consistent with need, shortage, and nearby tradition. Few argued, fewer nonetheless resisted. Superstitions and people practices coexisted with legit doctrine. Amulets had been worn, charms spoken, and distinctive bushes or springs viewed as sacred. The church tolerated so much of this, provided that it didn't venture its authority straight. Over time, these customs had been absorbed or redefined. A well became a holy website, a local spirit renamed a saint. Exchange came not via decree, however, by quiet substitution. Iteration via new release. Death, when it got here, was handled ritually and communally. The priest administered final rites, the body washed and wrapped, and the funeral mass carried out with gradual ceremony. Burial happened in consecrated ground, more commonly near the church. Graves had been marked with picket crosses or, for the wealthier, with stones. There was once no satisfactory fear in dying. Most effective, the hope for salvation, and the prayers of these left behind. The doctrine of purgatory, a situation of transitority struggling, influenced the dwelling to present prayers for the lifeless, and much had been commissioned for this reason. The lifeless had been remembered for the period of All Souls' Day, and their names spoken aloud within the dim candlelight of the nave. In all of this, religion used to be now not felt as something extraordinary. However, as anything average, stable, and anticipated. It was no longer wondered most of the time, nor analyzed deeply. It used to be absorbed by way of repetition, by way of ritual, and via quiet remark. The priest, regularly the only knowledgeable person within the village, held authority, but no longer by means of drive. His voice was acquainted, his habits predictable, his phrases most often repeated from reminiscence. His presence at births, marriages, and deaths linked the villagers to something higher, something unseen, but not unfamiliar. And so, within the daily lifetime of the Center Ages, faith used to be not a second, however, a presence now not loud, no longer harsh, now not dramatic, but regular, quiet, and pervasive. It shaped how individuals greeted the morning, how they labored via the day, and the way they back to sleep at night. It marked time not with urgency, however with rhythm. It gave structure, comfort, and continuity. Within the small village, below the dim mild of candles and the slow chime of bells, it used to be with no trouble there, as anticipated, and as ordinary, because the turning of the seasons and the warming of the fireplace. In the small, self-contained world of the medieval village, life used to be formed not most effective, with the aid of the average rhythms of the seasons and the everyday routines of work and rest, but also via a slower, more deliberate constitution, an internet of tasks, permissions, dues, and customs, which collectively shaped the process often called feudal governance. This system used to be not written in a single code or enforced with pace, however existed as a quiet, deeply rooted subculture, understood with the aid of most, and questioned via few. It operated no longer by way of day-to-day instructions, but through expectation, repetition, and the regular weight of precedent. The village itself did not govern independently. As an alternative, it existed inside a manor, a unit of landholding and authority overseen via a lord, who might live to tell the tale the estate, or more traditionally, elsewhere. The lord, probably a knight, a noble, or a monastic house, didn't normally involve himself in daily affairs, especially if his holdings have been far away or numerous. As a substitute, his interests have been represented by marketers, contributors, tasked with ensuring that rents had been accrued, fields have been labored, and order was maintained. These dealers integrated the steward and the reeve, each primary, however, mostly unseen figures in the average rhythms of village life. The steward was once the lord's essential manager. He might oversee a number of manors, and would visit periodically, visiting from estate to estate to review accounts, check up on harvest yields, and preserve courtroom classes. His visits had been rare, however, predictable. He was once ordinarily literate, in a position to read and write in Latin or French, and carried with him rolls of parchment, bound in leather or saved in picket tubes, on which money owed, responsibilities, and fines have been recorded. He did not arrive unannounced. Phrase of his strategy would spread slowly, giving the village time to arrange, fields tidied, animals secured, roads cleared of obstruction. On an extra commonplace foundation, governance was once conducted by the reeve, a local man elected or appointed from among the many villagers themselves. The reeve was now not continually favored, however he used to be, as a rule, revered. He knew everybody, and everybody knew him. His project was to implement responsibilities, to ensure that labor because of the Lord used to be carried out, that rents were paid, and that disputes have been noted. He used to be in general reward during assessments of land and property, and often served because the spokesperson for the village when dealing with external authority. His function used to be now not hereditary, and his time period could final, AYR or extra, renewed via consent, or replaced without fanfare. The reeve didn't rule, but he administered. He maintained records of who owed what number of days of labor on the domain, what number of hens at St. Martin's Day, what number of bushels of barley to the granary. He additionally checked the communal equipment, plows, carts, and oxen groups shared among villagers, and ensured their usage circled fairly. In disputes, he would mediate. In absences, he might word the motive and document it. His days were crammed, not with commands, but with walking, watching, reminding, and infrequently writing, if he would write, or dictating to a clerk if he could. Now not. The centerpiece of nearby governance was once the manorial court, a common and formal gathering of villagers, reeve, steward, and every so often the Lord himself, held in a specified place, most likely a corridor, a barn, or an open area. The court met at intervals for the duration of the year. On the whole, at Michaelmas, Candlemas, or Lammas, marking the agricultural calendar, with authorized oversight. It was not a courtroom within the today's feel. There have been no judges in robes, or advocates in argument. Instead, the courtroom was once a meeting of tenants, with selected villagers, known as the jury of presentment, reporting on breaches of customized encroachments, or unfulfilled obligations. Cases brought before the manorial court have been hardly ever dramatic. They worried boundary disputes, failure to keep fences, the unauthorized chopping of timber, or the neglect of land. Occasionally, a quality could be levied for brewing ale and not using a license, for preserving a dog unrestrained, or for failing to attend church. The fines had been modest but recorded. The court's clerk, often hooked up to the steward's retinue, wrote these in a courtroom roll, an extended sheet of parchment inscribed with cautious handwriting, later stored within the manor archive, bundled by using 12 months and tied with wire. Attendance on the manorial court used to be no longer not obligatory. Nevertheless, it was now not perpetually enforced strictly. Those summoned had been anticipated to show up, to pay attention, and to consent. Silence was commonly taken as agreement. When choices had been made, they reflected no longer personal preference, however, communal expectation. Customized, once headquartered, was rarely modified. New cases had been more commonly resolved via reference to historical ones. It used to be approach of precedent, not debate. The atmosphere was once not antagonistic, nor hurried. There used to be no need for urgency. Disputes that would no longer be resolved have been postponed, back to again at the subsequent courtroom, or allowed to lapse until they have been forgotten. Landholding approach, too, used to be a part of this governance. Land was once not owned outright, however held in tenure. A peasant's strip of land was not granted freely, however, in trade, for labor, produce, or provider. These duties have been cautiously described. 2 days' work per week on the Lord's land for the period of iciness, 3 in the course of harvest, a chicken at Easter, a coin at Whitsun. The agreements were most commonly oral, remembered, with aid from elders or the reeve, and most effective many times written down. There used to be a slow and methodical fine to this method, now not distinct, but continual. In higher manners, assessments have been conducted annually. The steward would walk the fields, measure yields, check up on barns, and query tenants. He could file how many sheep had been stored, what number of eggs produced, how many acres tilled. These assessments told taxes and rents. If yields have been poor, they possibly adjusted. If too low, explanations have been required. But punishments were not often severe. Most stewards have been cautious. They knew the land wanted its tenants, and the tenants needed the land. There used to be no reap in evictions, no use in threats. Balance, not revenue, was once the goal. Justice, when required, used to be gradual and uneven. For severe crimes, theft, assault, or worse, a bigger courtroom might be invoked, more commonly requiring journey to a local town or city. But such concerns had been amazing in small villages. Most disagreements concerned shared resources, minor slights, or breaches of pursuits. These had been handled within the manor. Compensation was desired over punishment. A public apology, or the forfeiture of a day's labor would suffice. There was no detention center, handiest responsibility. Shame, now, not force, maintained order. During all this, documents accrued. Court docket rolls, employee rolls, tithe ledgers, and surveys, every written slowly by hand, stored in chests, hardly ever learned but constantly preserved. These documents gave form to reminiscence. A villager would are living his complete life without studying his own name. However, he would know that it had been written once, long ago, on parchment, now yellowing in a manor chest, tied with leather-based, marked with wax dot. And so, in the quiet governance of the core ages, power used to be not expressed by way of violence or speed, but by means of documentation, custom, and presence. The reeve's quiet footsteps, the stewards each year talk over with, the court's tender murmur of court cases. These had been the sounds of authority. There was no paperwork in the modern feel. Most effective a slow and constant reinforcement of subculture. Governance, like labor, was once a dependency. It moved with the seasons, repeated its forms, and asked not for change, but for continuation. In this manner, the village was not dominated from afar, nor left to chaos. It was guided, slowly and softly, by way of arms and voices recognized to all. And in this steering, there was once now not freedom as we understand it. However, neither was there confusion. There was best order, quiet and acquainted, underneath, the watching eyes of folks that remembered what had been done before, and anticipated it to be done again. In the quiet world of the middle a long time, the place-time used to be no longer marked with the aid of the clock, but by using the turning of the solar, the alternate of light, and the progress of plants. The year moved slowly, predictably, and customarily in repetition. The peasant's life, lived in proximity to soil and seed, used to be formed not by way of novelty, however, through hobbies. Each and every season held its own duties. Each and every obligation used to be expected. And the fields, stretching in open strips throughout the panorama, didn't rush. The year started out, no longer in January, but in early spring, though in truth, there used to be no strict opening, best a gradual emergence from the stillness of winter. As the days lengthened and the soil softened, work resumed cautiously. To start with, as the ground dried and the air warmed, this was once the time of ploughing. The heavy wood plough, tipped with iron, used to be drawn through teams of oxen throughout the long, slender strips of land that made up the open field process. Every family held a number of strips, scattered throughout the manor, ensuring an equitable division of excellent and poor soil. The ploughman moved slowly, the oxen straining at a constant percent, the ploughshare turning furrows with deliberate force. There used to be little speech. The work used to be long and needed attention. Stones were removed, roots cut, and furrows straightened. Behind the plough, the soil lay exposed, moist, and dark, able for seed. This used to be adopted via harrowing, when a picket frame, set with picket or iron enamel, was dragged throughout the earth to interrupt the clods and tender the surface. Then got here sowing, typically through hand. Seed, normally wheat, rye, barley, or oats, was forged across the land with a gradual, sweeping motion. The sower walked at a measured percent, dipping into the seed pouch and letting the grain fall evenly, a rhythm realized with the aid of commentary and memory. The approach used to be repeated daily unless each assigned strip had been sown. A baby or elder would comply with, scattering chaff or scaring birds, although no field used to be ever wholly freed from birds. As spring deepened, weeding commenced. It used to be dull work, requiring stooping, pulling, and cautious awareness. The tools have been easy, a knife, a hoe, or simply naked palms. Thistles, nettles, and wild grasses have been eliminated. Their roots were burned or left to dry. Work was shared among the many loved ones, and between families, when wanted. The percent of labor was once no longer pressing, but power. Via summer, season, awareness shifted to other tasks, the preservation of boundaries, the repair of ditches, and the care of livestock. Sheep had been sheared, their wool cleaned and saved. Hens laid more ordinarily. Milk from cows and goats used to be amassed and slowly became too cheese, curdled and pressed over days, left to age in cool corners. Bees had been tended, fields had been watched, and the hedgerows, now full, have been trimmed again with sufferer effort. Haymaking commenced in late June or early July. This was an predominant venture, though now not always remembered in chronicles. The meadowlands, unique from the tilled fields, have been cut with scythes, the lengthy blades reducing by means of tall grass in even arcs. The reduced hay used to be left to dry, then became with wooden forks. When entirely dried, it was once gathered, bound in sheaves, and saved in barns or haystacks, raised from the damp ground on wooden frames or stones. This hay would feed the animals via iciness. Without it, the herd might not continue to exist. Then got here the harvest, the imperative second of the agricultural year. It began with barley and oats, followed by wheat and rye. The complete village took part. Reapers moved slowly down the strips, chopping stalks with sickles and laying them in bundles. At the back of them, gleaners followed youngsters, the aged, the negative collecting what fell or used to be missed. The sun was high, and the days were lengthy. Meals was brought to the fields. Water was once carried in leather-based flasks. Dialogue was once minimal. The rhythm of reaping, bundling, and carrying repeated with calm necessity. Sheaves had been tied and carried to threshing floors. The place grain used to be separated from stalk by beating it with flails. Lengthy jointed sticks wielded in rhythmic movement. The sound used to be dull but constant. Threshing would proceed for weeks. The grain used to be then winnowed, thrown into the air so that the wind might blow away the chaff. Ultimately, it was sacked, stored, or measured for tax, tithe, and rent. What remained could be flour into flour, a slow method itself, carried out on the village mill, powered by using wind or water, with long queues and little variation. As autumn settled, awareness became to planting wintry weather plants, exceptionally rye and wheat. These have been sown early, adequate to take root earlier than frost. Again, the plough grew to become soil. Once more the seed was scattered. Again the harrow smoothed the earth. It was a repetition of spring's tasks, though finished with larger urgency. As the times now shortened and the weather grew unsure, manure was spread, collected from cattle yards, pigsties, and midden thousands, and dug into the soil with care. Fences had been checked. Roofs were thatched. Firewood was once gathered, slowly and without haste, from managed woods, customary lands, or fallen branches. The woods have been to not be trespassed frivolously, chiefly if held by the Lord. Gathering too much, or reducing residing bushes, would result in a quality dot. As winter arrived, the fields have been left on my own. A stillness settled over the land. Most days were spent indoors, in dim gentle, engaged in spinning, mending, or carving instruments. A while was spent tending animals, whose stalls required mucking, feeding, and consistent attention. Chickens, pigs, cows, and sheep had been stored in small enclosures or lean-tos. Fodder used to be rationed, hay used to be portioned, salted, meat used to be carefully drawn from barrels and served in thin slices. Ale used to be brewed in small batches, its fermentation sluggish and uncertain. The work of winter used to be no longer absent. However, it used to be diminished. Flax fibers have been combed, nettles were boiled into wire, instruments had been sharpened by way of firelight, and reviews were repeated. They were not wonderful reports, however familiar ones, of ancestors, of harvests earlier, of winters remembered, and of saints whose feast days marked the passage of time. In the course of all this, the cycle of the three-field method endured. One field used to be planted with iciness, grain, yet another with spring plants, and the 0.33 was once left fallow, to leisure, to recover, and to acquire manure. This rotation ensured fertility, reduced pests, and spread labor. Over generations, it grew to become a dependency, then a rule. Altering it was no longer regarded. There was once no want. It worked well, ample, and within the center a while. Good, adequate, used to be frequently sufficient. And so the year handed, slowly, predictably, and without shock. The agricultural cycle was once now not a sequence of movements, but an extended and unbroken activities. Work adopted work, season followed season, and the land, as soon as cleared and marked, required little innovation. Fields were ploughed, seeds have been sown, crops had been harvested, and the process began. Again, no year was the equal, but each year felt alike. In this, the villagers located now not excitement, but steadiness. The weather might alternate, and yields might fluctuate. However, the obligations remained. Each and every season introduced work, and each and every work had its time. There was no rush, however neither was there leisure. The land did not wait, however it did not hurry. And those that lived by means of it discovered its percent, slow, regular, and invariably returning. Within the day-to-day lifetime of the middle, a long-time health was once a quiet presence, neither guaranteed nor overlooked, but managed with pursuit's care, cautious attention, and gradual therapies. Health problem was permitted as part of existence's common path, neither continually surprising nor dramatic, however traditionally lingering within the background, dealt with by means of familiar practices that had been passed down from new release to new release. The physique, much like the land or the household, required renovation and repair, not in haste, but in measured, repetitive approaches. The notion of formal medicine, as understood at present, was limited. There have been few physicians, and people who existed have been by and large located in towns or universities, some distance from the agricultural village. Their skills was once derived from old texts, many written in Latin and hardly ever translated for common use. Treatments had been complex, slow, and high-priced. Most villagers never saw a physician, however, relied as an alternative on the regional healer, the clever lady, or the apothecary where one existed. The intelligent girl, customarily a midwife or herbalist, held a quiet, however predominant situation in village lifestyles. She would support in childbirth, offer herbal poultices, and endorsed on therapies for usual illnesses corresponding to headaches, fevers, or belly complaints. Her competencies was once empirical, headquartered on commentary and repetition, amassed over decades and passed orally. She gathered herbs from the fields and woods, chamomile, yarrow, nettle, and lavender, getting ready infusions, salve, or decoctions, every with specific software and gradual instruction. Normal ailments have been often dealt with these herbs, applied externally as poultices or infused into teas. For illustration, chamomile probably steeped for its calming characteristics, even as yarrow might be overwhelmed to staunch minor wounds. These therapies weren't instantaneous treatments, but smooth aids, helping the physique's common techniques over days or even weeks. The taste used to be ordinarily bitter, the smell earthy, and the effects subtle. When health problem deepened or signs worsened, prayer and ritual might be brought to herbal care. The sign of the cross used to be remodeled the patient. Holy water, blessed through the priest, might be sprinkled. Relics, small objects associated with saints, have been many times touched to the body or placed local. These acts were quiet, reverent, and repetitive, forming part of a higher perception. In divine assistance alongside earthly treatments, the midwife used to be liable for extra than just childbirth. She taught younger ladies about hygiene, although hygiene itself used to be understood another way than today, instructing on the cleaning of wounds, the care of the new child, and the statement of indicators and signs. Births took position, at home, normally with shut female loved ones nearby. Labor was lengthy and sluggish, attended with cloths, natural preparations, and whispered encouragement. When issues arose, cures had been restrained and results unsure. The presence of the midwife, however, was consistent and reassuring. Hospitals in the medieval feel had been rare and by and large connected to devout associations. They weren't places of cure as we assumed them in these days, however, almost always served as hospices or shelters for the bad, travelers, or the chronically sick. Care was easy: food, heat, and prayer. When scientific remedies were given, they integrated bloodletting, the application of leeches, and purgatives, all slow and usually hazardous procedures, administered via those educated in idea, however, restricted in observe. The idea of the four humors, blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, dominated medical. Figuring out wellness used to be inspiration to rely upon their stability, and ailment a effect of imbalance. Remedies aimed to revive this stability, more often than not by way of weight loss, plan, leisure, or bleeding. The system was once slow and repetitive. Purgations and bloodletting have been repeated over days or even weeks. The outcome had been unsure, however, accredited as a part of the typical order. Food regimen itself was once visible as fundamental to well-being. although meals alternatives have been constrained. A food plan heavy in grains, greens, and now and again meat or fish used to be typical. Ale and vulnerable beer had been inebriated more commonly, partly for hydration, partly for vitamin. The water supply was once usually detrimental, so these drinks have been favored. Foods have been taken slowly, with concentration to moderation. Overeating was once discouraged, as was once idleness. Hygiene practices were easy, however regular. Washing was once completed in basins or rivers, most commonly weekly or less, depending on weather and assets. Garments had been converted and washed as more commonly as viable, usually in river water or at residence with lye cleaning soap created from ashes and fat. Baths have been infrequent, however, when taken, were slow and generally ritualized, involving herbs and oils. Hair was combed, though now not continually reduced normally. In times of epidemic plague, measles, or influenza, responses have been slow and disorganized. Villagers could isolate the unwell, burning affected clothing or bedding, or relocating the unwell to separate huts. Prayers and processions were prepared, asking for divine mercy. However, clinical skills did not enable for speedy therapies, and plenty have succumbed to illness. Those who survived had been as a rule left weakened, however persisted their labor as equality they would. Demise, when it approached, used to be met with quiet instruction, the sick perhaps anointed with oils, and final rites given by means of the priest. Loved ones and neighbors gathered, speaking softly, supplying heat, and repeating prayers. The dying were laid on straw beds, protected with simple cloths. The system was slow, with days or even weeks passing in gradual decline. In this manner, wellness and therapy were not dramatic episodes, however slow. Careful approaches integrated into the float of daily existence. Cures had been repeated, prayers uttered, and care given regularly. There have been no miracles for many. However, there was once fidelity, remedy, and continuity. The body was tended very like the fields, with persistence, expectation, and quiet hope. Within the unhurried rhythms of medieval life, food was both necessity and ritual, ready and preserved with care, dependency, and patience. Each and every meal mirrored the season, the resources at hand, and the gradual accumulation of competencies, handed down via generations. There was little urgency, no innovation demanded, handiest the quiet repetition of tried methods, adapted to the constraints of time, climate, and social fame. The daily events of food instruction began early, on the whole at daybreak or quickly thereafter, with the lighting fixtures of a small fire within the fireside. This hearth used to be central, no longer best to cooking, but additionally to warmth, gentle, and gathering. It was once tended slowly, with portions of dry wood introduced in measured amounts, the smoke rising gently through the chimney or louver. The hearth's glow furnished a consistent, soft illumination, steady and calming. Grains have been the staple of the medieval weight loss plan, principally for peasants and villagers. Bread, probably coarse and dense, used to be baked from rye, barley, or wheat, relying on regional availability. The grain had been milled, mostly on the village watermill or windmill, an approach that took hours and required standing in quiet traces. Flour was sifted, though now not finely, leaving the bread heavy but sustaining. Mixing the dough used to be a gentle procedure. Water, flour, and generally a leavening agent, ordinarily sourdough starter, were combined in a colossal wood bowl, or trough. Palms labored slowly, urgent, and folding the combination, except it reached the right consistency. The dough was left to rise, many times for hours, underneath a material or close the warmth of the hearth. It was once a quiet waiting, marked through little alternate, besides the gradual increase in volume. Baking was once finished in a communal oven, if one existed. These ovens have been big, stone or brick constructions heated with the aid of wooden fires, their interiors achieving steady warmness over the direction of a day. When the hearth was banked and ashes removed, loaves were positioned inside of. The door closed cautiously, and the warmth allowed to bake the bread slowly. The scent of baking was once refined and comforting, filling the small village with a faint, regular presence. Foods had been simple. Porridge, made via boiling oats or barley in water or milk, was once usual for breakfast or supper. It was once stirred slowly, most often with a picket spoon, and eaten warm. Greens, cabbage, onions, leeks, beans, and peas have been ready. by way of boiling or roasting, close the fire. Meat, when on hand, was frequently salted or smoked to maintain it. Fresh meat used to be reserved for feast days or exact events, as farm animals were priceless property to be conserved. Maintenance was important for survival. Via winter months when contemporary produce was scarce, salting used to be the principle. Processed meat and fish were reduced into strips or chunks, full of coarse salt, and hung in cool, dry places. This procedure was once gradual, requiring weeks or months earlier than the meat might be consumed safely. Smoking was once normally employed, utilizing gradual burning wood to impart taste and further dryness. These preserved foods were then rationed cautiously over time. Pickling veggies in brine or vinegar was once practiced. Although vinegar was much less common in rural areas, root veggies, comparable to turnips and carrots, would be stored in cool cellars or buried in damp sandpits to lengthen spoilage. Apples and pears had been stored in baskets or hung from rafters. Dairy merchandise had been changed into cheese or butter, which, if saved cool, lasted longer than recent milk. Ingesting water was once almost always detrimental. Alternatively, ale and vulnerable beer, brewed from barley or rye, have been customary everyday beverages, consumed at all hours. Brewing used to be a gradual process, involving soaking grain, allowing it to germinate, drying it in a kiln, after which fermenting the mash in wood barrels. This took weeks and required cautious monitoring of temperature and timing. The ensuing drink was nourishing, however moderate, with low alcohol content material. Cooking tools had been few and simple. Pots made from clay or iron, wooden spoons, knives, and spits for roasting. Ingredients were cooked slowly over open flames or within the embers of the fireplace. Stews, essentially the most fashioned dishes, simmered for hours, combining grains, greens, herbs, and sometimes meat or fish. The sluggish warmth softened components and blended flavors gently. Meals used to be eaten communally or in household organizations, most often with fingers or easy-picket utensils. Consuming was once a quiet affair, not hurried, with small bites and sips. Conversation was subdued, punctuated via the sounds of chewing and the occasional clink of wooden bowls or cups. Cleansing after ingredients used to be also slow and careful. Utensils were scraped and rinsed, oftentimes in cool water, repeatedly wiped with cloths. Grease and food scraps had been in most cases saved to feed animals. The fireplace was tidied, ashes shifted, and fire stoked again for warmness by means of the night. On this measured process to food, the village sustained itself via seasons, worry, and a lot. There were no surprising feasts, no extravagant dishes. For many, best a consistent, quiet guidance of sustenance. The work of feeding was slow and deliberate, marked with the aid of repetition and endurance. As a result, meals instruction and preservation weren't events. However, procedures accelerated over time, involving many small tasks repeated every day and seasonally. The rhythm of cooking matched the rhythm of lifestyles itself, calm, continuous, and predictable. In the measured percent of medieval village lifestyles, clothing used to be no longer a matter of trend or usual alternate, but of necessity, repair, and sluggish creation. The construction of textiles was once a long, steady system, woven into the everyday rhythms of labor and relaxation, with duties repeated by way of hand, usually by way of women and children, over months and seasons. The fabric worn was each a defense towards the factors and a marker of social function, yet its making was once slow and laborious, with little variation from one garment to another. The raw substances for apparel came mostly from the land and the animals tended local. Wool used to be the most normal fiber, gathered from sheep that had been shorn once a year, most often in late spring or early summer. The shearing was once performed carefully, using shears designed for the task, and the fleece collected in bundles. After shearing, the wool was once sorted via grate cleaned of dirt and debris, and all set for further processing. Getting ready wool for spinning used to be a gradual and cautious venture. The raw fleece used to be washed, most often in bloodless water, with mild soap constructed from ashes and animal fats. It was once then dried and teased aside by way of hand or with comb-like instruments known as cards. This carding aligned the fibers, making them less complicated to spin into thread. Carding was repetitive and quiet work, performed indoors during the less warm months, most of the time near the hearth. Spinning used to be valuable to fabric creation. Making use of a spindle or spinning wheel, the carded fibers had been drawn out and twisted into thread. The spinner's hand moved rhythmically, pulling fibers and winding thread with sluggish, even motions. The spindle, quite often a easy wood stick weighted with a small stone or whorl, spun ceaselessly within the air, a quiet associate to the spinner's work. Spinning would take hours on a daily basis, and was most commonly done via women or kids, often whilst sitting with the aid of the fireplace or performing different small duties. As soon as spun, threads have been wound into skeins and then washed, once more to do away with oils or impurities. The thread was once then able for weaving, which took position on a loom. Looms ranged from simple, upright frames to bigger, horizontal treadle looms. Weaving was gradual, requiring the cautious interlacing of warp and weft threads to create material. The weaver's arms moved in repetitive patterns, pulling the shuttle from side to side across the loom. The ensuing cloth was, in general, coarse, undyed, and sturdy, acceptable to day-to-day wear and the needs of village existence. Dyeing cloth was once one more, not obligatory step, undertaken if resources allowed. Normal dyes have been derived from crops, roots, and bugs. Woad and indigo produced blues. Madder root yielded reds. Weld and chamomile supplied yellows. Dyeing was a gradual approach, involving soaking cloth in vats for hours or days, then drying it carefully. The colors have been usually muted, fading with time and repeated washing. As soon as fabric used to be able, it used to be reduced and sewn into clothes. Tailoring was simple. Most apparel consisted of tunics, robes, cloaks, and hose, with minimal decoration. Seams were sewn by using linen or wool thread, with stitches small and normal. Needles were manufactured from bone or metallic and have been used cautiously to avoid hazardous the fabric. Buttons were infrequent, and fastenings have been quite often ties or pins. Restore and maintenance have been consistent components of garb lifestyles. Holes were mended with patches or darning. Hems strengthened, and worn areas retouched. Clothes had been traditionally passed down, reused, or repurposed. When garments became too worn for public use, they probably reduced into rags for family cleansing or stuffing. Sneakers was in a similar fashion useful. Footwear and boots have been made of leather-based, crafted by means of regional cobblers. The procedure worried tanning hides, chopping patterns, stitching pieces collectively, and becoming soles. Shoes were sturdy, however simple, designed for strolling fields, roads, and village streets. Like garb, they were repaired when feasible and worn until unusable. Wool and linen were the principal fibers, with linen derived from flax crops. Flax was once grown, harvested, and then processed in a long sequence of steps: retting, soaking in water, breaking, crushing stalks, scutching, disposing of woody parts, and hackling, combing fibers. Every stage used to be gradual and manual, requiring repetition and persistence. The resulting flax fibers had been spun into fine thread for undergarments, shirts, and lighter fabrics. Linen garments were prized for his or her relief and cleanliness, however, had been most of the time limited to the wealthier villagers or used as underwear. Wool was more normal for outer garments, offering warmness and sturdiness. The making and mending of apparel used to be now not a separate occupation for many villagers, but part of daily life, built into household duties. The work used to be sluggish, rhythmic, and required little spoken communication. Commonly, a couple of generations labored collectively, sharing the labor and passing down techniques without formal instruction. That as a consequence, apparel and fabric creation within the core a long time was once a steady cycle of construction, wear, restore, and eventual reuse. It was once no longer hurried, nor designed for kind, but for function and endurance. The fabrics and clothes were humble, their making methodical and unvarying, their presence on the body a quiet testament to the sluggish, constant workings of village lifestyles. Within the gradual relocating fabric of medieval lifestyles, schooling was a quiet thread, most commonly thin and unevenly woven. Finding out, as we realize it in these days, was neither common nor speedy, but constrained most often to precise locations and people, handed slowly from master to pupil, and ordinarily all in favor of devout or useful concerns. Literacy used to be infrequent among the many general populace, and when it used to be reward, it was once developed over years, of gradual follow as an alternative than through structured education. For almost all of villages, formal schooling was once generally inaccessible. Most youngsters discovered advantage at home or in the fields, gazing and imitating father and mother and elders. Useful skills, farming, cooking, sewing, and craftwork, was once received through repetition and fingers-on expertise. This casual finding out was steady and unhurried, woven into everyday existence rather than separated into specific lessons or lessons where literacy existed. It was quite often found within the church. Monasteries, cathedral faculties, and a few parish church buildings had been facilities of finding out. Monks, clergymen, and clerics spent long hours copying manuscripts through hand, studying Latin texts, and educating a small quantity of scholars. The system of finding out to learn and write was sluggish and methodical, involving careful practice of letters and phrases, repetition of prayers and psalms, and copying of texts. Books themselves had been rare and helpful, created from parchment or vellum, prepared from animal skins by means of a gradual and laborious approach. They were steeply priced and time-drinking to supply. Writing was done with quills dipped in ink produced from very welgals or soot, requiring constant palms and concentration. Each and every letter was once formed intentionally. The scribes worked sluggish and meticulous. Most texts had been in Latin, the language of the church and scholarship. Vernacular languages had been opening to be written, but manuscripts in these tongues had been distinct. Reading aloud was once customary observe, whether within the cloister or the schoolroom, reinforcing studying by way of repetition and sound. For noble kids, some guide probably supplied by means of personal tutors or in small faculties, specializing in reading, writing, and arithmetic. Guideline was once repetitive, involving copying letters, memorizing religious texts, and finding out general numeracy for managing estates. Progress used to be gradual and depended on the scholar's diligence and the teacher's persistence. In villages, some kids attended rudimentary parish schools, if such existed regional. These schools were simple, usually held in church constructions or rented rooms. Teaching was oral and repetitive, with emphasis on memorization of prayers, catechism, and sometimes common literacy. Self-discipline was once corporation, however. Sluggish-paced, lessons quick and spaced over many years. Writing materials for daily use were scarce. Wax tablets with a stylus had been used for temporary notes or exercises, their surfaces cleaned for reuse. Parchment and ink had been reserved for principal files. Most villagers communicated orally, counting on reminiscence and spoken phrase. Letters and legal files had been typically composed by clerks or scribes, who performed this work for individuals who might not read or write. That the transmission of capabilities was for this reason gradual and constrained. It depended closely on oral way of life, apprenticeship, and everyday practice. Reports, customs, and realistic advantage had been passed down quietly and regularly. The PC of studying matched the percent of life, gradual, steady, and deliberate. Even the teaching of numbers was once common, excited by counting farm animals, measuring land, and calculating rents or taxes. Abacus use was once rare in villages, however, more original in towns or amongst merchants. Tricky arithmetic or literacy was no longer necessary for most, and the absence of these potential used to be permitted as average. In this manner, education and literacy were not widespread, but were parts of a larger procedure of potential and tradition. Studying was much less about innovation and extra about preservation. It was a continuous, unhurried system, embedded in devout devotion, realistic desires, and social order. For that reason, as the day ended and the village settled into quiet darkness, so too did the minds of its inhabitants rest, having absorbed the sluggish lessons of life, land, and religion. The passing of advantage was once smooth, repeated, and enduring, very similar to the constant turning of the seasons or the sluggish weaving of material. And so, in the event you had woken up one morning within the center a long time, you might have located yourself in an international governed by using calm repetition, quiet routines, and sufferer endurance. A global where time moved gently, where each task adopted from the last, and where the slow percent used to be both constraint and remedy.